There are some shipwrecks that tell stories of tragedy and loss, but this story is different. This is about a warship that became one of the most perfectly preserved time capsules in human history. And it all started with a voyage that lasted exactly 20 minutes. On August 10th, 1628, thousands of people lined the shores of Stockholm harbor. They were there to witness the maiden voyage of Vasa, Sweden's most magnificent warship. What they saw instead was one of the most spectacular naval disasters in history. But here's what makes this story incredible. That disaster became the greatest gift to archaeology the world has ever seen. The Vasa warship didn't just sink, she vanished into the depths of Stockholm harbor and remained there almost perfectly intact for 333 years. When she was finally raised in 1961, what emerged was nothing short of miraculous. A 400-year-old warship so well preserved that you could still see the intricate carvings on her hull, still smell the oak in her timbers, and still walk through rooms that hadn't seen sunlight since the 1600s. Today, millions of people visit the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, but few know the full story of how this maritime time machine came to exist. Let's start with what Vasa was supposed to be. In 1625, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden had ambitious plans. Sweden was locked in brutal conflicts across Europe, and the king needed a flagship that would strike fear into enemy hearts. The order went out: build the most powerful warship in the Baltic Sea. The Royal Shipyard in Stockholm began construction in 1626. What they created was a monster of naval engineering. Vasa displaced 1,210 tons and bristled with 64 cannons. That's more firepower than most navies possessed in their entire fleet. Her two gun decks housed 48 massive 24-pounder cannons, each weighing over a ton. These weren't just weapons, they were statements of Swedish power. But Vasa wasn't just built for war, she was built for spectacle. The ship's hull was covered in hundreds of carved sculptures, each one painted in brilliant colors. Mermaids twisted around the stern, sea monsters snarled from the bow, Roman emperors gazed imperiously from the sides. Lions, griffins, and mythological heroes covered every surface. At the center of it all was a carved image of King Gustavus Adolphus himself, depicted as a young boy with golden hair, flanked by griffins representing his father. These weren't just decorations. In the 1600s, a warship's carvings were psychological warfare. When enemy sailors saw Vasa approaching, they were supposed to feel the weight of Swedish authority and power bearing down on them. Every figure, every detail was designed to intimidate and impress. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Dutch sculptors worked alongside Swedish carpenters to create what was essentially a floating palace of war. Paint residue found centuries later revealed that these sculptures blazed with color, reds, blues, golds, and greens that would have made Vasa visible from miles away. By early 1628, Vasa was nearly complete. She carried a crew of 145 sailors and could transport 300 soldiers. This wasn't just a warship, she was a troop transport, a floating fortress, and a symbol of Swedish naval supremacy all in one. But there were warning signs that something was terribly wrong. In the summer of 1628, Captain Suffring Hansen decided to test Vasa's stability. He ordered 30 men to run back and forth across the upper deck, while Vice Admiral Claes Larsen Fleming watched. As the men ran from port to starboard and back again, Vasa began to roll violently from side to side. The motion was so extreme that Fleming, one of Sweden's most experienced naval officers, ordered the test stopped immediately. He was genuinely worried the ship might capsize right there at the dock. That should have been a red flag. Instead, preparations for Vasa's maiden voyage continued. August 10th, 1628, dawned calm and clear in Stockholm. A light southwest breeze rippled across the harbor. Hundreds of thousands of people, some estimates say the entire population of Stockholm, gathered to witness Vasa's departure. This was the social event of the century. The king's flagship was finally ready to take her place in the Swedish fleet. At around 4 p.m., Vasa cast off from the royal palace dock. Her 4 sails were set to catch the gentle breeze. Her gun ports were open, ready to fire a ceremonial salute as she departed. Everything seemed perfect. Vasa sailed majestically through Stockholm's inner harbor, past the crowds of cheering spectators. She had traveled about 1,400 yards when she entered a more exposed area where the wind was stronger. Then, disaster struck in a matter of minutes.
A sudden gust of wind filled Vasa's sails and pushed her over to port. The ship heeled dramatically, but as her crew cast off the sheets, she righted herself. The crowd probably thought this was just part of the show, a demonstration of the ship's power and agility. But then came a second, stronger gust. This time, Vasa heeled so far to port that her open gun ports dipped below the waterline. Water began rushing into the lower gun deck. Within moments, tons of seawater were flooding into the ship's hold. The weight of all that water made Vasa heel even further, allowing more water to pour in through the gun ports. In full view of hundreds of thousands of horrified spectators, the pride of the Swedish Navy began to sink. Other boats in the harbor rushed to help, but it was too late. Vasa went down in less than 20 minutes, taking 30 crew members with her. The rest of the crew managed to swim to safety or were rescued by the boats that came to their aid. The king was furious. This wasn't just a naval disaster, it was a national humiliation. King Gustavus Adolphus declared that the sinking was the result of imprudence and negligence and demanded that those responsible be punished. An official inquest began in September 1628. A tribunal composed of members of the Admiralty and Privy Council investigated every aspect of Vasa's construction and launch. They questioned the surviving crew members, examined the ship's design, and tried to determine exactly what had gone wrong. In the end, no one was punished. The blame fell on the original shipbuilder, Henrik Hybertson, who had conveniently died before Vasa was completed. But the real reason for the disaster was far more complex than anyone realized at the time. Modern analysis has revealed that Vasa was doomed from the moment her keel was laid. The ship suffered from a catastrophically high center of gravity. Her gun decks were built higher than they should have been, and her massive cannons, which made up 5% of her total displacement, were positioned too high in the ship. But there was even a more fundamental problem. Vasa was built by different teams using different measurement systems. Some parts of the ship were constructed using Swedish feet, which measured 29.69 centimeters. Other parts were built using Amsterdam feet, which measured 28.31 centimeters. This seemingly small difference meant that the port side of the ship was actually heavier than the starboard side. Combine an already unstable design with this weight imbalance, add the tremendous weight of 64 cannons positioned high in the ship, then open the gun ports and sail into a strong wind, and Vasa's fate was sealed. Within days of the sinking, attempts were made to raise Vasa. An English engineer named Ian Bulmer actually managed to right Vasa on the seafloor, but couldn't lift her out of the mud. The Swedish crown eventually abandoned these efforts, and Vasa settled into her long sleep beneath Stockholm harbor. For 333 years, Vasa lay on the bottom of the harbor at a depth of 105 feet. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. The conditions that sank Vasa also preserved her perfectly. The brackish water of Stockholm harbor, with its low salinity and cold temperature, created an environment hostile to the shipworms and bacteria that normally consume wooden ships. The lack of oxygen at that depth meant that organic materials simply didn't decay. Instead of rotting away like most shipwrecks, Vasa was essentially pickled in the Baltic Sea. Generations of Stockholmers forgot about the warship resting beneath their harbor. The location of the wreck was lost to history. But in the late 1950s, a Swedish marine archaeologist named Anders Franzen became obsessed with finding Vasa. Franzen had studied historical records and calculated that Vasa should be somewhere in Stockholm harbor, perfectly preserved by the unique water conditions. For years, he methodically searched the harbor floor with a core sampler, a device that could bring up samples from the seafloor. In 1956, his persistence paid off. His core sampler brought up a piece of blackened oak, then another. Divers went down to investigate and found something incredible. A massive wooden ship sitting upright on the harbor floor, her hull almost completely intact. Even more amazing, thousands of artifacts were still aboard. Everything from sailors' personal belongings to spare sails, from cannonballs to wooden sculptures. The decision was made to raise Vasa, but this would be one of the most complex marine salvage operations ever attempted. The ship weighed over 1,200 tons and had been sitting in mud for over 3 centuries. One wrong move could destroy the archaeological treasure forever. Between 1957 and 1959, divers worked in the cold, murky water of Stockholm harbor to prepare Vasa for raising. They dug 6 tunnels underneath the ship's hull, threading massive steel cables through these tunnels to create a cradle that could support the ship's weight. The raising operation began in August 1959. Using pontoons and winches, the salvage team made 18 separate lifts over the course of a month, gradually bringing Vasa up from 105 feet to 52 feet below the surface. Each lift was a nail-biting operation. Too much stress on the hull could cause the ancient timber to collapse. Finally, on April 24, 1961, Vasa broke the surface of Stockholm harbor for the first time in 338 years. What emerged was beyond everyone's wildest expectations. The ship looked like she had sunk yesterday, not centuries ago. Her hull was intact, her carved decorations were still in place, and her gun ports could still be opened and closed. When archaeologists entered the ship, they found chambers that were like stepping back in time to the 1600s. Sailors' sea chests contained their personal possessions, clothes, pipes, coins, even playing cards. The ship's galley still held cooking pots and plates. Spare sails were neatly stored in the sail room. Cannonballs were still stacked in the magazine. But the most incredible discoveries were the human remains. Vasa had preserved not just objects, but people. The skeletons of crew members who had been trapped when the ship sank were still in the positions where they had died. These remains provided unprecedented insights into 17th century life. Their clothing, their health, even their diet could be analyzed. The preservation was so complete that scientists could still identify different types of wood used in the ship's construction. They could analyze the rope and rigging, study the construction techniques, and even examine the remains of food in the ship's stores. Vasa had become the most complete 17th century warship in existence, a floating museum that had been waiting underwater for over 3 centuries. But raising Vasa was only the beginning of the challenge. The ship's wood, after 333 years underwater, was like a waterlogged sponge. If allowed to dry out naturally, the timbers would shrink, crack, and collapse. The ship that had survived centuries underwater could be destroyed in months by exposure to air. Swedish conservationists developed a revolutionary preservation method. For 17 years, Vasa was continuously sprayed with polyethylene glycol, a waxy substance that gradually replaced the water in the ship's timbers. This process stabilized the wood and prevented it from deteriorating. During this preservation period, Vasa was housed in a temporary building called the Vasa Varved, the Vasa shipyard. This facility served as both a conservation laboratory and a public museum. Visitors could watch scientists and conservators working to preserve the ship while learning about its history. The work was painstakingly slow. Every piece of the ship had to be cataloged, studied, and preserved. Thousands of artifacts were recovered, cleaned, and conserved. The ship's sculptures were carefully restored, revealing their original colors and details. Meanwhile, Vasa was teaching historians things they had never known about 17th century naval warfare, shipbuilding, and daily life. The ship was like a library of information about a world that had been lost to time. In 1981, the Swedish government decided that Vasa deserved a permanent home. Plans were made for a purpose-built museum that would display Vasa in all her glory. Construction began in 1987, and the following year, Vasa was carefully moved to her new home. The Vasa Museum officially opened in 1990, and the response was overwhelming. This wasn't just another maritime museum, it was a chance to walk aboard a genuine 17th century warship and experience history firsthand. The museum designers created a multi-level viewing experience. Visitors can see Vasa from her keel to her fighting tops, walking along galleries that provide views of the ship from every angle. They can peer into the gun decks where sailors once lived and worked. They can see the ornate stern castle where officers would have stood during battle. But Vasa offers more than just spectacle. The museum tells the human stories behind the ship. Facial reconstructions show what the crew members looked like. Displays reveal their names, their ages, their backgrounds. The 30 people who died when Vasa sank aren't just statistics, they're individuals with stories. The museum also doesn't shy away from the questions that Vasa's story raises. Why was such an unstable ship allowed to sail? How could experienced naval architects make such fundamental errors? What does Vasa's sinking tell us about the pressures and politics of 17th century Sweden? Some answers are clear. Vasa was built during a period when Sweden was desperately trying to establish itself as a major European power. The pressure to build bigger, more impressive warships led to design choices that prioritized appearance and firepower over seaworthiness. King Gustavus Adolphus himself may have contributed to the disaster. Historical records suggest that he ordered changes to Vasa's design during construction, demanding more guns and more decoration. These changes upset the ship's carefully calculated balance. The use of different measurement systems reflects the international nature of 17th century shipbuilding. Swedish shipwrights worked alongside Dutch carvers and German gun founders, each group bringing their own traditions and standards. The lack of standardization that sank Vasa was typical of the era. Today, the Vasa Museum is one of the most visited museums in Scandinavia, attracting over 1 million visitors annually. But Vasa's influence extends far beyond Stockholm. The ship has revolutionized our understanding of 17th century naval warfare. Before Vasa was raised, historians knew these ships mainly from paintings and written descriptions. Vasa provided the first opportunity to study an actual warship from this period in complete detail. The preservation techniques developed for Vasa have been used to save other archaeological treasures around the world. The methods pioneered by Swedish conservators are now standard practice for preserving waterlogged wood and other organic materials. Vasa has also become a cautionary tale studied in engineering schools worldwide. The ship's sinking is a classic example of what happens when design compromises and political pressures override basic engineering principles. But perhaps most importantly, Vasa connects us directly to the past in a way that few archaeological discoveries can match. When you stand in the Vasa Museum looking up at this magnificent warship, you're seeing the same carvings that Stockholm residents admired in 1628. You're walking through spaces where 17th century sailors lived and worked. The ship that was supposed to demonstrate Swedish power for decades instead demonstrated the power of the sea to preserve history. Vasa's 20-minute voyage became a 400-year journey through time, carrying stories and secrets from the age of kings and sailing ships into our modern world. The warship that failed so spectacularly in life succeeded beyond all measure in death. Vasa didn't conquer Sweden's enemies, she conquered time itself, emerging from the depths as one of archaeology's greatest treasures. Today, as you walk through the Vasa Museum, you're not just looking at a ship, you're looking at a miracle of preservation, a testament to human ambition, and a reminder that sometimes our greatest failures can become our most enduring legacies. The crowd that watched Vasa sink in 1628 witnessed what they thought was an ending. They had no way of knowing they were actually watching the beginning of one of history's greatest archaeological adventures, a story that would span centuries and captivate millions of people who would never have heard of a Swedish warship if she hadn't sunk in Stockholm harbor on that August day over 400 years ago.